Question. Dear Kim, I have a question. I'm not sure if you already did a video on this. I'm aware of consciousness and I know how to be conscious and I practice it daily. But I don't know why I can't stay conscious all the time. Especially when throughout the day something difficult happens, like I get tired or hungry, or I made a mistake or heard some bad news. My consciousness just slips out and I separate myself, and then I act and communicate unconsciously. Staying conscious feels so draining when common everyday life issues are happening. How do I stop falling back to unconsciousness? I hope that makes sense. I love your videos, by the way. Thank you. Okay, so it a little bit depends on what you mean with being conscious. I mean, you have people who talk about you have an awakening experience, and then it may last for some time and then you go out of it again. Or there are people in the field of mindfulness that say that you usually you have to close your eyes and withdraw your attention from outer things, and then you are mindful. You're just being instead of acting and doing, or thinking for that matter. And so you have many of these spiritual teachings where the goal is that you are, instead of being absorbed in outer things and everyday things, you are stepping back and you are more aware, more conscious, you're being instead of doing, different ways of expressing it, right? But the first thing I would say about this is that the immediate reason why we fall out of being more aware or conscious is that we have unresolved psychology in the subconscious mind. I have many videos where I talk about these separate cells, subconscious cells we have in the subconscious mind. It's like a reactionary pattern. So the person mentions something happens during the day, I get some bad news, and what happens is that these impulse coming to you from the outside triggers one of these subconscious cells you have. And all of a sudden, as I explained, the core of your being is the conscious you, and the conscious you is pulled into the self, and now you're reacting through the self. All of a sudden you're seeing the world through the self. So you could say that one way to describe this being conscious is what I've described in many videos, that the conscious you is able to step outside your outer personality, made up of all these subconscious selves. So you step outside of that and you're more aware, you're more conscious. You are, some people call it the silent witness. Instead of being engaged in judging everything, you're just witnessing what's happening. So if that's what you mean with consciousness, that's certainly a valid experience to have. But then if you have these subconscious selves, you are pulled into them whenever something happens that demands your attention. So this is one thing, and that's why I explain in many videos that the goal of the spiritual path is to resolve these subconscious selves one by one, so there is less of a pull on the conscious you. And therefore you can stay conscious, you can stay aware more of the time. But I would also question, why have you gotten this idea that you're supposed to be conscious, so to speak, all of the time? And I think that's where some, especially Eastern teachings, have created a lot of unnecessary confusion in people. Because I think in order to explain this, we have to make a distinction here. You can deal with everyday life in two ways. One is that you are reacting through one of these subconscious selves. And the subconscious selves, as I say, are often based on the duality consciousness. There's this value judgment. This should be happening, this should not be happening. And this means that when you're reacting through such a self, you often feel a sense of resistance to things that you think shouldn't be happening. And therefore you are very colored by this. You have a very emotional reaction to it. You get angry, you get irritated, you feel ashamed, you feel guilty, whatever. All of these kind of feelings. And this is a sign you have a subconscious self you're reacting through. Another common reaction is that you have, instead of an emotionally based subconscious self, you have a thought-based subconscious self, and all of a sudden there's a situation where now you're analyzing, you're constantly analyzing, thinking, oh, why did I do that? Why did that person do this? Why did this happen? This shouldn't have happened. All of these mental evaluations. And you can even have a subconscious self that's more focused on your sense of identity, where you feel threatened by something. For example, many people that have a strong opinion about some political issue, and then somebody expresses a different opinion, and suddenly they feel threatened. Because even at the level of identity, you have identified with this political issue. Like I've said many times before, when I was young and went to university, I met these born-again Marxists. And they were so on edge with everything. Anything that didn't correspond to their worldview, they immediately felt threatened. They had a very strong reaction having to try to prove other people wrong. And of course, you see the same thing today with many political issues. So what I'm saying is this is one way to react. And this is a very common way, of course, that people react to things. And it's clearly that pulls you out of consciousness, however you describe it. So you don't want to do that. And that's what I'm saying. The spiritual path is really overcoming all of these very value-laden selves. But you have to then also say, is there another way to react to everyday situations that isn't based on this value judgment? And of course there is. You can be neutral about it. But see, we are living in a physical body. We are living in a physical world. There are things we have to do. Do you have to be conscious all the time? What I'm trying to say is that depending on how you define this being conscious, because there are some spiritual people I met, and even some spiritual teachers, they want to define it that basically you could say, you're conscious of God all the time. Whatever you do, you're conscious of God. But quite frankly, if you are riding a bicycle through heavy traffic at rush hour, is it necessary to be conscious of God while you're doing this? Isn't it better to have all of your attention on not getting hit by a car? You see what I'm saying? I'm not talking about having in your mind while you're riding the bicycle, you are thinking about some political issue and arguing with somebody in your head. I'm just talking about you're just focused on this physical task you're doing. I don't see the need to be always spiritually aware when you engage in physical tasks. That's why you have this concept, and I've run across it since my first spiritual movement, actually since I read Yogananda's book, that you have these supposedly very spiritual people who are sitting in a cave all day meditating on God. Now, I respect free will. If that's what people want to do, that's fine. But the only way they survive is that somebody comes and gives them food, and that food has to be grown or harvested, and it has to be brought to them. So they're really living off of others. And so, is that really the highest spiritual approach? Couldn't you have another approach that says, you can be engaged in the world, you can be doing worldly things, but you're not doing it with a worldly state of consciousness, because you're always attached, you're always evaluating everything with this value judgment, right and wrong, good and bad, shouldn't happen. You're just focused on the task you're doing while you're doing it. And then when you stop doing it, well, then you can go back to whatever you want to be aware of. So I think it's fine to say you want to be mindful, you want to go on into a state of meditation, and you want to connect to your higher self, for example. And it's necessary to set aside some time to do that. But I don't see the conflict between doing everyday activities and being connected to a higher self, for example. I understand where this is coming from, because when I was new on the path, I did have experiences where I would go into meditation, I would connect to my higher self, and I couldn't maintain it in my everyday life. And there was a big contrast between the two. But as I've grown on the spiritual path, gotten rid of some of these subconscious selves, there's less and less of a contrast. And, you know, I wouldn't say, as the person is saying, that I just slip out of consciousness when I'm doing everyday activities. I'm just focused on that activity. It's like you go into meditation, you're focusing within, but now you're just focusing without. But you're not reacting through one of these separate selves. And, you know, it's again this, the goal in some Eastern spiritual teachings and even some non-duality teachings is that you should withdraw from the world because the world is not spiritual. But as I've explained in my video about how the world was created, we are created to be co-creators. And we are created to expand our sense of self, and we expand our sense of self by interacting with our environment. So there's nothing inherently unspiritual about doing things in the world. And the way I look at it is that I think back 20 years ago, maybe even less, 10, 15 years ago, I would often have these mental arguments in my mind where I would go over situations and I would argue back and forth, and it would get nowhere. I mean, it was just a waste of mental energy. And I don't have that hardly anymore, because when I'm doing an activity, I just focus on that activity and not thinking about something else while I'm doing it. I'm just focused. And then when I'm not doing that activity anymore, then my mind is just free to do whatever I want to do, whatever I want to focus on. So I just don't see the big problem there. I mean, it's kind of like the contrast between being aware and being unaware becomes less. Or maybe you come to a point where you're not really unaware, even when you're doing other things that takes your occupation, that occupies your mind, because you're not really reacting to anything. And I think that's a much better state to come to, where you're neutral. And so what I'm trying to say here is that the person is saying, staying conscious feels so draining when common everyday life issues are happening. Well, to me, this indicates that if something is draining your energy because there's a tension in your mind, there's a resistance, you are feeling that you should be conscious. And you should be conscious while you're doing everyday activities. So you are kind of dividing your attention. It's like when you're doing something, it really requires your full attention. You are trying to force your attention. Oh, I should be conscious, I should be conscious. And it just creates this division, this resistance in your mind. And obviously that's mentally draining. So that's why I'm saying, you're doing some physical activity. What's wrong with focusing all your attention on that? When you're done with activity, then you can choose what you want to focus on then. And if you don't have these subconscious selves that pulls you into reacting all the time, you can focus on whatever you want. I mean, you can instantly be free of any worldly concerns and focus within if that's what you want to do. But I also think that, you know, as I said, there's the ancient, going back very far in the East, you know, the Buddha sitting in meditation under the bo tree and just meditating, being totally non-attached and oblivious to the world, basically. So that's one, and it's not that it's a bad principle. It's only one principle. It's sort of the alpha, and there's two sides of everything, alpha and omega. The Tao Te Ching, you know, the yin and the yang. There's always these two, and so the omega polarity to the Buddha is the Christ, who, like Jesus showed, goes out among the people, interacts with the people, challenges the scribes and Pharisees and the money changers, and seeks to awaken people. And so it's not that one is better than the other. They are both needed. And there may be some people in this lifetime, they should focus on the Buddhic ideal, that's fine. But why put down the Christ ideal, which is out there helping people? Because in a sense you could say that the Christ, by interacting with other people, leads to more growth. And so I just feel that you can come to a point where you have attained a certain level of Christ consciousness, Christ discernment, which means you are not pulled into all these reactionary patterns. You've resolved your reactionary patterns. But now, instead of going within and meditating on God, you're focused on helping other people. You're focused on doing something positive in the world. You're focused on being a co-creator, really, who is expressing yourself and your creative abilities in the world. And I think for most people in this age, this is the more constructive spiritual image to have. And I think really many, many people in the modern age, and for that matter going far back, they have actually put themselves in this state of inner tension, inner resistance, inner strain, because they are trying to force themselves to live up to this ideal of being withdrawn from the world, being conscious, being focused within, being focused on God, however they see it. But they can't escape doing things in the world. So what I'm saying is, you just decide, oh, there's things I need to do in the world. Then you're focusing 100% on that. And then if you have nothing you need to do in the world, you might say, okay, now I go within. And you effortlessly go from one to the other. So, in other words, you're not even coming to the point where you're saying, oh, whenever I'm doing something, I'm not conscious. Because I'm only conscious when I'm sitting there in meditation and being completely quiet and so forth and so on. There comes a point where the distinction between the two just fades away. And you're just focused on, instead of focusing on yourself, you're focused on how can I help other people, what's my role in the world, what do I need to do? And you're not feeling this is taking away from anything. On the contrary, this is really part of why you're here. It's part of your life plan.